Welcome back. We are going to talk about listening today. This goes along with chapter 5 in your textbook, so make sure that you read chapter 5 before you start the lesson today. So I want to start with this overall question. Are listening and hearing the same thing? Think about this, and we're going to come back to this question at the end. So, why did I make you watch that War of the Worlds video? Well, if you listened closely, the story of War of the Worlds is about a broadcast that was done over the public radio system of a play. And the whole part of the play was, or the whole part of the radio broadcast was that people were freaking out because they didn't understand that it was fictional. They were just tuning in or not really fully listening to, the memos that said, this is a dramatization of the War of the Worlds. Or they had it on the whole time and they just weren't really listening. So they turn on the radio station and they hear about aliens invading New Jersey and all of this stuff. So they start to believe that it's happening. So the whole story of it comes back to the idea that only about 50% of the people were actually listening. And that brings us to this point of when we are actively listening to something, we can typically only recall about 50% about what was said. I think this is really important when we are thinking about our speeches. I always tell you guys to make sure that your opening and your closing are very strong, and that's really because that is what people recall the most. So you have to, think about what you're putting in because only about 50% of what you say is going to be recalled. So you want to make it engaging and exciting so that, they can easily listen to it and hopefully retain a little bit more than 50%. So the International Listening Association, yes, there is an international association for listening, defines listening as the process of receiving and constructing meaning from and responding to spoken and or nonverbal messages. Listening is really important. When we talk about communication as a whole, the first thing that probably comes to your mind is speaking. Communication is speaking. Well, listening is actually more important than what is said. Because if we can't listen and comprehend what other people are saying, then the communication model really just fails right there. So these are the three parts that make listening successful: knowledge, skills, and motivation. How many of you learned how to listen in school? Actively listen? Probably not many of us. We have classes like math, reading, writing, but nobody actually teaches us how to listen. So that's something that we're going to kind of focus on today, because we know it's something that we haven't learned before. So unless you really understand the principles and important functions of human listening, you may not even know that you need to listen. The skills section talks about how do you do it. Even if you know you need to listen, you might not have the skills to do it effectively. We talk about this a lot when we are talking about, study tips in school. How do you listen to lectures? Most people just can't learn by sitting there and hearing the words that are being said because we're not comprehending them. So that's why we do things like take notes or pair it with visuals so that we can read at the same time. Those all kind of go into the skills of how do we do it effectively. And motivation. You have to be motivated to want to listen. Knowing you need to listen and knowing how to listen are two different things. Unless you want to listen, listening will not become a natural lifelong practice. Part of my job as an advisor is listening. That's 95% of it. I can't give any recommendations or advise a student unless I'm listening to what they're saying so I can understand where they're at, what they need help with. If I just jumped right to conclusions and started talking, I really wouldn't be helping the student. So I know in my job, I have to be motivated to want to listen so that I can solve the problem. So there are 4 types of listening I want to talk about: defensive listening, disruptive listening, pseudo-listening, and selective listening. Defensive listening is when we are listening to someone talk and already in our mind is turning and thinking of ways that we can combat what they're saying. We get defensive about it. We all know people that are like this, that they just kind of want to disagree with everything you say. And that active role of listening is when you're talking, they're already thinking about how to disagree or, how to not feel attacked. Disruptive listening, this is a tough one. And I know for me personally, this is something I need to work on. is when you're listening to someone, but you cut them off because you have a thought that comes into your mind and you want to speak from your listening. Pseudo listening is, pseudo means fake, not real. So it's that fake listening. How many times have you been in a conversation with someone when they're texting on their phone and just going, yup, but you know they're not really listening? That's an example of pseudo listening. And selective listening. Selective listening is when we only choose to listen to things that we want to hear. Think of, as a kid, how many times your parents told you to do your chores, take the trash out, make your bed. You didn't want to hear that, so you selected not to listen to that. That's what selective listening is. It's only really listening to what you want to hear. All of these are barriers within listening. And we know that if we are demonstrating any of these, that we're not truly listening the way that we are supposed to. So I do want you all to think of ways that you do this in your everyday life. Really be critical of yourself, because I know I can look at everything and I can really think of actions that I do that fall within each one of them. And then focus on how you can combat that. When you see yourself doing that in everyday life, stop yourself, pause, and then try to go backwards and really listen to what the other person is saying. All right, listening problems. So these are some problems that come in with everyday listening. So again, just think of yourselves in these and when you might do it. A listening bias is when you have preconceived feelings or attitudes causing you not to listen holistically. So maybe you disagree with what the person is talking about. So from the very beginning, you make that judgment that you don't agree with them. So you're not really truly listening to what they have to say, even though we don't 100% know where this conversation is going to take us. Maybe you can find some common ground that you agree with the person with, but you won't know if you're not listening. Failure to focus. This is a really big one when we're thinking about class lectures, or we're in class, or maybe listening to something that we're having trouble focusing on. So this is when your mind is wandering. Technology can be causing distractions, words being too complicated. This is the thing when I tell you in your speeches to look for any words that you might not understand or that you think your audience might not understand. Because if you're using those big words that are too complicated, you're going to easily lose your audience's focus. Medium distractions. So the channel which the message is being delivered obstructs our ability to receive the message. For example, if I am at a conference and the microphone has really bad feedback, it's kind of fuzzy, that's an idea of medium distractions. I really can't comprehend or hear their message because the way it's being delivered obstructs our ability to receive the message. This would be the same thing if you are at a sports game and you're trying to have a conversation with the person you're with, but it's just so loud in the stands that you can't hear their message. Source distractions. So this is when the person delivering the message is distracting. There can be a million different examples of this. For example, if you're talking to someone and they have food in their teeth, what are you focusing on? You see the food in their teeth and you're not really focusing on the message that they're saying. Like I said, there's a lot of examples of this. If they're speaking too soft, that's kind of an example of the source distraction and a medium distraction. But it's something that the person who's delivering the message is doing that's distracting. Situational distractions. The environment is distracting. If there's a lot going on in a place, you're going to have trouble concentrating. Think of having a conversation in a busy restaurant, on a train when there's a lot of people going back and forth. You're not able to focus because of the situation. Listening anxiety. So we know with anxiety when it comes to speaking is very prevalent, but it's also there in listening. If you're very anxious, you're focusing more on yourself, and it can really inhibit your ability to focus. Judging too soon. Not listening because you've already judged the situation. So how can we be a better listener? So this right here is called the hurrier listening model. I think it's the name hurrier from the first letter in each of these words. And these are just the steps that you can take to be a better listener. Hearing. So hearing, when we talk about hearing, that's the sound waves. And that's think of the volume. If you can't hear clearly, then you're definitely not going to be able to listen because you can't understand. Understanding is the second step. Number 3 is remembering. So after you listen to something, really storing it in that part of the brain where you can remember later. Interpreting. So you have that message in your head. You have to figure out what does that mean to you? How do you put it into this conversation? Evaluate. That's making your judgment on whatever conversation you're having. And then responding is the other part of communication, of giving your feedback to the person. So all of these steps really happens every day in a conversation. And think of it as a pyramid. So if you can't hear something, you can't do any of the other steps. In order to be able to get to the evaluating step, you have to hear, understand, remember, and interpret all the steps. So I want to bring us back to this original question. Are hearing and listening the same thing? The answer is no. Hearing is just the sounds. Listening is an active process. So when someone says, I hear what you're saying, but I'm not listening, that means they're hearing the sounds that you make, but listening is that active process of making sense of it and being able to respond to it. All right, and that is the end of this screencast. Let me know if you have any questions.